There are moments in a person's life that arrive quietly, without fanfare or warning, dressed in the ordinary clothes of an ordinary evening. A dinner reservation, a birthday celebration, a glass of wine raised in celebration. And then the glass tips, deliberately, slowly, with the full intention of humiliation, and the warm red liquid cascades across a white shirt, and the room goes silent, and the man holding the empty glass smiles. What he does not know, what none of them know, is that earlier, that same afternoon, the man standing there dripping in Merlot had signed a set of documents that transferred full ownership of that smiling man's company into his own hands. The predator had already been purchased. He simply hadn't been informed yet. Before we go any further, if you're new here, take a moment and hit that like button and subscribe. Stories like this one are why this channel exists, because sometimes truth is so much more devastating, so much more perfectly constructed than anything fiction could manufacture. And if you're watching from somewhere tonight, drop your city in the comments. The community here spans every corner of the world, and every single one of you matters now. Let's begin. Marcus Hale was by every visible measure a man in decline. That was the story that circulated in the circles his wife Vivian moved in. The dinner parties and gallery openings and charity galas that had become her world more than his. He had once been part of that world equally back when the architecture firm he co-founded was young and hungry and winning awards. Back when Vivian looked at him across crowded rooms, the way people look at someone they are still discovering. That was 7 years ago. 7 years is a long time. Long enough for the texture of a marriage to change completely while the surface remains convincingly smooth. Marcus was 41. Vivian was 38, and her birthday, the evening that would become the pivot point of everything, was 3 weeks away when Marcus first noticed the shift. Not the shift in Vivian. That had happened more gradually, in increments too small to pinpoint on any single calendar day. The shift he noticed was in the way she handled her phone, the way she tilted the screen, the way she laughed at messages she did not share. He noticed, and he noted, and he said nothing. Because Marcus Hale was not a reactive man, he was the kind of man who waited until he understood the full architecture of a situation before he decided what to build with it. The name that eventually emerged through the kind of careful, patient attention that people rarely credit quiet men with possessing was Donovan Priest. Donovan was 44, the founder and chief executive of a mid-sized commercial real estate investment firm called Priest Capital Group. He was the kind of man who wore his success like a second skin, effortlessly, constantly, in a way designed to ensure that no one in the room ever forgot who had the most. He drove cars that announced themselves. He ate at restaurants where the wait list was itself a status symbol. He donated to causes prominently enough that his name appeared on buildings, and he made sure the buildings were in neighborhoods where people he wanted to impress would see them. Marcus had learned all of this not through jealousy-fueled investigation, but through the same methodical research instinct that had made him an exceptional architect. You do not design a structure without first understanding its load-bearing elements. Donovan Priest, it turned out, had a significant structural problem. Priest Capital Group was carrying a debt load that its revenue streams could not comfortably sustain. The commercial real estate market had shifted beneath Donovan's aggressively leveraged portfolio like a slow geological fault, and the cracks invisible to the casual observer were deep and widening. Donovan needed either a substantial capital infusion or a graceful exit. What he had, instead, was a carefully maintained facade, a beautiful exterior concealing serious foundation damage. And Marcus, who had spent his career reading facades and foundations, saw it immediately. What Donovan did not know, what he could not have known, because Marcus had been operating in an entirely different professional sphere for the past 3 years, was that Marcus's architectural practice was no longer the center of his financial universe. 3 years earlier, Marcus had quietly partnered with a small private equity group that specialized in acquiring undervalued real estate adjacent businesses. His role was analytic and advisory at first, contributing the kind of deep structural knowledge of commercial property that pure financial people rarely possessed. But his contributions had been significant enough, and his instincts sharp enough, that his stake in the partnership had grown considerably. By the time Donovan Priest began appearing in Vivian's phone and Marcus's peripheral awareness simultaneously, Marcus's net worth, held almost entirely in private instruments that left no public footprint, was something in the neighborhood of $40 million. Vivian, who had categorized her husband as a modestly successful architect in gentle professional decline, had no idea. The couple's visible finances, the comfortable but not ostentatious house, the reasonable cars, the careful lifestyle, had been Marcus's deliberate choice. He was not a man who needed to be seen. Donovan Priest, it would turn out, needed to be seen more than he needed almost anything else. That need would cost him everything. The birthday dinner was Vivienne's idea, and Marcus had raised no objection to any of it. Not to the restaurant, which was exactly the kind of place Donovan would have suggested, all exposed stone and imported lighting and a sommelier who treated every question as an opportunity to demonstrate superiority. Not to the guest list, which included 3 couples from Vivian's social orbit, her sister Claudia and Claudia's husband, and, naturally, Donovan Priest, introduced to the gathering with the breezy vagueness of an old friend of the group. Not to any of it. He helped plan the event. He reserved the private dining room. He ordered flowers. He arrived early, stood at the head of the table to greet guests, and smiled with the particular warmth of a man who has chosen his moment and is content to wait for it. He had signed the documents that morning. The acquisition of Priest Capital Group's majority stake, executed through his equity partnership, using a holding company 3 corporate layers removed from Marcus's name, had been finalized at 11:47 that morning in a lawyer's office 6 blocks from the restaurant. The previous week had been a carefully orchestrated sequence, an approach to Donovan's primary creditors through an intermediary, a proposal structured to look like a straightforward debt resolution, a valuation exercise, and a transfer agreement that gave Donovan enough liquidity to clear his most pressing obligations in exchange for 53% controlling ownership of the company he had built over 12 years. Donovan had been desperate enough to accept. He had been arrogant enough to believe the buyers were a faceless institutional group who would leave him operational control. Both beliefs served Marcus perfectly. The documents existed. The transfer was complete, and Donovan Priest, who that evening straightened his jacket before entering the restaurant and thought about how to position himself at the table relative to Marcus, did not know any of it. Dinner began with the ease of people who are practiced at social performance. Wine was poured, a Bordeaux, that the sommelier presented with an explanation no one had requested. Donovan held court at his end of the conversation, which he treated as a singular entity that he alone could properly direct. He told a story about a property deal in the financial district that had required his personal intervention to save. He told another about a sailing trip cut short by weather that he had navigated with impressive calm. He referenced his watch in the act of apparently checking the time, which is a maneuver so transparent that only the person performing it ever believes it is subtle. Marcus ate his food and listened and said, when he spoke, the kinds of things that prompted others to continue talking. He was interested in people, even people like Donovan. Perhaps especially people like Donovan, because people like Donovan were so reliably consistent. They behaved according to their nature with the faithful regularity of weather system. The incident happened at the moment when dinner had achieved the comfortable looseness of second glasses of wine. Vivian laughed at something Donovan said, a bright, unguarded laugh, the kind Marcus remembered from their early years, and Donovan, emboldened by it, by the wine, by the audience, by the long-cultivated belief that Marcus was a diminished presence unworthy of serious regard. Turned to Marcus with a smile that was shaped like warmth and composed entirely of contempt. "Marcus," he said, in the tone of a man addressing a minor clerical concern, "I've been meaning to ask, how's the firm holding up? I heard things have been a little quiet." The table did not go silent. Not yet, but something shifted in the air, the way it does when a social maneuver of genuine cruelty enters a room dressed as casual curiosity. Marcus looked at Donovan with an expression of mild interest. "We've had a productive year," he said. "Selective projects, the ones worth the time." Donovan's smile widened slightly in the way that smiles do, when they are not really smiles. "Selective." He repeated the word with the particular inflection that transforms an adjective into a diagnosis. "That's a generous way to put it. My." He reached for the wine bottle with the comfort of a man at home in a space he believes he controls. And the next moment was one that Marcus would afterward describe to himself as entirely predictable, given everything he had come to understand about Donovan Priest's relationship with the concept of consequence. Whether it was deliberate from the first or became deliberate in the half-second of its execution was something Marcus never fully resolved. What was unambiguous was the result. The bottle tilted in Donovan's hand, directed with a motion just slightly too purposeful to be entirely accidental, and the remaining Bordeaux, perhaps 2 full glasses worth, arced across the table and landed with cold spreading certainty across the front of Marcus's white dress shirt. The table went silent. Properly, completely silent. Claudia's hand stopped midway to her water glass. Vivian's expression traveled through several countries in the space of a second. Donovan performed surprise. He performed it adequately, but not exceptionally. "God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. That was entirely my—" The bottle was slippery, the condensation. Marcus looked down at his shirt. Then he looked up at Donovan. He did not reach for a napkin immediately. He simply held Donovan's gaze with an expression so calm, so undisturbed, that the performance of surprise across the table became suddenly and visibly uncomfortable for its performer. "These things happen," Marcus said. His voice was entirely level. He accepted the napkins that a server had materialized with, dabbed at his shirt with the unhurried precision of a man who has determined that this moment does not require urgency. "Don't worry about it." Those words, "don't worry about it," landed in the silence with a weight that no one at the table could quite account for, because they were delivered without irony and without edge, but with a quality of absolute settled certainty that suggested Marcus was not offering reassurance, but delivering a verdict. Donovan laughed the slightly too loud laugh of a man. Recalibrating the table, resumed. "But—" Marcus excused himself, briefly returned with the shirt dampened but managed, and ate the remainder of his dinner with an appetite that seemed to genuinely puzzle the man sitting at the other end of the conversation. What Marcus had not said to Donovan, what he had said only to his own interior knowledge, quietly and without ceremony, was this: by 11:47 that morning, Donovan Priest had become his employee, not a direct employee, not yet. But the chain of ownership now existed, and what it ultimately meant was that the man who had just poured wine across a white shirt with the practiced carelessness of someone who believed his position was invulnerable was operating under a fundamental misapprehension of his own structural situation. Marcus had been in that position himself professionally, standing in a building that looked entirely solid while the foundation underneath had quietly, irreversibly changed. He knew exactly how that felt from the outside. He wondered briefly how it was going to feel to Donovan from the inside. He suspected he would find out within the week. In the days that followed Vivian's birthday dinner, the world continued its arrangements without apparent disruption. Vivian moved through the house with the slightly heightened energy of someone who has managed a situation and is relieved by its management. She mentioned the wine incident twice. Once to frame it as Donovan's clumsiness, once to frame it as Marcus's graceful handling of an awkward moment. What she did not do in either framing was, "Look at Marcus the way you look at someone when you are considering what they might actually be thinking. She had constructed her understanding of Marcus and lived inside it comfortably. It was, Marcus had come to recognize the most significant error of her life, and he carried the knowledge of it with the weight of genuine sorrow rather than satisfaction. He had loved Vivian carefully and for a long time. That love had not evaporated, but it had transformed into something more honest and less accommodating. The kind of love that can recognize, without flinching, that the person you love has made choices that cannot be walked back to a place of wholeness. He had spoken to an attorney 2 weeks before the birthday dinner, not to announce intention, but to understand options. He had not filed anything. He was not in a hurry. He was, as he had always been, patient in proportion to the weight of the matter at hand. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the birthday dinner. Marcus was in his office, the real one, not the architecture studio, the private office connected to the equity partnership, when his phone rang, displaying the name of his acquisition attorney. "The notification goes out today," the attorney said. "Standard process. The new ownership structure gets formally disclosed to Priest Capital's senior leadership team. Donovan Priest will receive his copy as the named prior majority holder." "Thank you," Marcus said. He ended the call and returned to the site plans on his desk, because the moment did not require anything more dramatic than that. What happened next was something Marcus did not witness directly, but reconstructed thoroughly through accounts that reached him with the reliability of water finding its level. Donovan Priest received the disclosure documents at approximately 2 in the afternoon in his corner office at Priest Capital Group's headquarters on the 14th floor of a building he had always regarded as an expression of himself. The documents were dense and formatted with the neutral precision of corporate legal language, and it took Donovan several minutes to fully process what they communicated: that the debt, restructuring, and capital acquisition he had executed 10 days earlier, which he had understood as a transaction with a financial institution, had been executed on behalf of a holding entity that was itself controlled by a private equity partnership of which Marcus Hale held a 27% stake and served as a managing partner. Marcus Hale, Vivian's husband, the architect with the quiet ear, the man who had accepted a glass of wine poured across his shirt with the unnerving serenity of someone who already knew the ending. By all accounts, Donovan sat with the documents for a long time before he moved. When he did move, it was to make phone calls to his attorney, to the intermediary who had facilitated the transaction, to 2 board members who could not tell him what he wanted to hear because the transaction was entirely legal, entirely proper, and entirely irrevocable. The structure was sound. The foundation had already been transferred. What Donovan occupied now was not a building he owned, but a building he lived in at the discretion of someone else. Marcus received a call from Donovan that same evening. He let it go to voicemail. The message was carefully composed, a request for a meeting, professional framing, a tone so controlled that the effort of that control was the most audible thing in the recording. Marcus listened to it once and set the phone face down on his desk. He waited 2 days before responding because there was no operational reason to respond sooner and because he was not interested in performing urgency he did not feel. When he called back, he was brief and cordial and suggested they meet for coffee rather than lunch because coffee is a meeting that can be concluded in 30 minutes without social obligation, and Marcus had no desire for a longer performance than the situation required. They met at a place Marcus chose, a simple cafe on a quiet block, without the architecture of importance that Donovan preferred for his professional interactions. Donovan arrived looking like a man who had spent the past 2 days relearning how to stand inside his own body. He was immaculate. The clothing, the grooming, all of it. But there was something in the set of his jaw and the careful arrangement of his expression that communicated the enormous effort of that immaculateness. He was working very hard to look like someone for whom things were fine. He sat down. He ordered a coffee. He arranged his hands on the table with deliberate casualness. "I have to be honest," he began. "When I saw the documentation, my first thought was that there'd been some kind of error." "There wasn't," Marcus said. Donovan absorbed this with a small nod. "No," he said. "I understand that now." He paused. "I find myself wondering what the intention is going forward." Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "The intention is to run a properly capitalized real estate investment operation. I have people who will be involved in that. You'll be introduced to them. Your operational role continues for the time being, conditional on performance metrics that will be outlined in a separate document." "For the time being," Donovan said. "For the time being," Marcus confirmed. Donovan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had been stripped of several of its habitual registers, and what remained was something more unguarded than Marcus had previously heard from him. "I'd like to understand how this happened," he said. "I had due diligence done on the acquiring entity." "You did," Marcus agreed. "Your people looked at the holding company, which was structured to be clean and unexceptional, and they found what was there to find. What connects that holding company to my partnership isn't visible without going considerably deeper, and I don't believe there was motivation to go considerably deeper, because the deal was attractive and Priest Capital needed it." The accuracy of this was something Donovan could not dispute, and the experience of not disputing it was clearly something he was navigating in real time. "And Vivian," he started. "Is my wife," Marcus said. The two words were quiet and complete and carried the weight of everything they chose not to say. "That's a separate matter and not a professional one." Donovan looked at Marcus for a long moment. Something in that look acknowledged, for perhaps the first time, that the person across the table had not been what Donovan had decided he was: a gentle, fading man, easy to dismiss, safe to disrespect. The recalibration was visible. It was, Marcus thought, overdue. "The birthday dinner," Donovan said. His voice was careful, choosing each word the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "The wine was unfortunate," Marcus said simply. "I accepted your apology at the time, and I have no further position on it." He picked up his coffee. "Let's talk about the operational timeline." What he did not say, because he was not that kind of man, because cruelty had no practical application in his value system, was what he had been thinking in that restaurant, standing in a wine-soaked shirt, looking at Donovan's performed surprise with the stillness of someone who has already decided the game's outcome and is simply watching the remaining pieces play out. He had not been thinking about revenge. He had been thinking about the documents signed that morning, about the clean mathematics of what had already transpired, about the strange, particular sadness of a man who does not know his own situation, and about Vivian, and about what came next, and about the long, careful work of deciding who you are in the aftermath of being profoundly disappointed by people you loved. The conversation at the cafe lasted 22 minutes. Marcus paid for both coffees. When he walked out into the morning air, he did not feel the swelling triumph of a vindicated man. He felt instead the quiet, specific clarity of someone who has resolved a structural problem correctly and can now move forward with sound footing. Satisfaction, yes, but the measured kind, the kind that doesn't require an audience. The news reached Vivian's social orbit with the efficiency that small worlds deliver significant information. Marcus was not its source. The business reality of Priest Capital's ownership transfer was a matter of corporate record, and the people in those circles moved in professional and social spaces close enough that the record became conversation within days. By the time Claudia called Vivian on a Thursday afternoon, voice carrying the particular frequency of someone delivering information they find both terrible and necessary, Vivian had already heard fragments and was in the process of discovering that the fragments assembled into something she had not known how to imagine. The conversation Marcus and Vivian had that evening was the most honest exchange they had managed in 2 years. That honesty had a quality of arrived odd, too late, that made it more painful than a bitter argument would have been. Vivian sat at the kitchen island they had chosen together from an architect's catalog 7 years ago. And she looked at her husband, really looked at him, with the particular attention of someone recalibrating what they are actually seeing. And she said, "How long have you known?" "About Donovan and you? Some months. About the financial opportunity? I recognized it when I started paying attention to him." He paused. "The two aren't disconnected, Vivienne. But one is professional and one is personal, and I've been careful to keep them that way." "You bought his company," she said. The sentence was flat and slightly disbelieving, as if she was testing whether the words sounded as extraordinary, spoken aloud, as they did in her head. "The partnership acquired a controlling interest," he said precisely. "Yes." Before the dinner, the morning of, Vivienne was quiet for a long time. The kitchen held the silence with the fullness of a space that has absorbed a great deal of life and knows how to carry it. Finally, she said, "And you said nothing. All through dinner, you let him." She stopped. "I let the evening be what it was," Marcus said. "I didn't engineer the incident at the table. I didn't need to. I simply allowed events to proceed while understanding something that no one else in the room understood." He looked at her steadily. "I've often understood things that no one else in the room understood, Vivienne. I'd just like you to know that." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with such measured sorrow that it functioned as something more comprehensive than any accusation could have managed. Vivienne's face moved through something complicated. She had spent months, perhaps longer, operating with an image of Marcus that was convenient and diminished, and the image was now demonstrably wrong in ways she could not minimize or reframe. "What do you want?" she asked. "To be honest with each other, finally," he said, "and to decide what comes next from that honesty, not from performance, not from what looks appropriate, from what's true." What was true was a conversation that took most of that evening and some of the next morning, and several further conversations over the weeks that followed. Marcus had already consulted an attorney. He was not interested in punishment or public spectacle. He was interested in a clean and fair accounting of a shared life, an equitable resolution, and the ability to rebuild something on ground that was actually solid, rather than ground that had been agreed upon as solid without being tested. They separated formally 6 weeks later. The terms were fair. Marcus had not hidden assets. A different thing from having assets Vivienne hadn't asked about. What he had accumulated was his to demonstrate clearly, and the settlement reflected it in ways that left Vivienne materially comfortable, and Marcus with a life he could construct honestly. Their attorneys described it as one of the more functional high-asset separations they had managed, which is perhaps the least romantic and most accurate tribute to two people who had, despite everything, retained the capacity for decency. Donovan Priest's relationship with Vivienne did not survive the altered context of its discovery, which is perhaps unsurprising, because the version of Marcus that Donovan had needed to believe in, diminished, unimportant, safe to disrespect, had been the load-bearing element of his own confidence. Without that specific fiction, the architecture of the situation did not hold. Donovan and Vivienne had been operating inside a story where he was the obvious superior, the dynamic and successful contrast to a fading husband. When the fading husband turned out to be the man who had purchased the morning before the birthday cake arrived, the story collapsed under its own structural dishonesty. Vivienne, to her credit, eventually arrived at an understanding of what she had lost that was neither self-pitying nor misdirected. She did not blame Marcus. She made no attempt to reframe her own behavior as something other than what it was. She told Claudia, who told it to Marcus later, that she had spent months looking at her husband and deciding what she saw, and that she had been comprehensively wrong, and that the particular pain of that wrongness was that it had been a choice, a comfortable choice, made daily to not really look. That observation reached Marcus in the form Claudia delivered it, carefully, with the hesitancy of someone who wasn't sure if they should be saying it, and he received it with the same quality of stillness that had characterized his response at the restaurant table. "She's not wrong," he said, and he meant it without cruelty, and without satisfaction. It was simply true, and he had always had a preference for things that were simply true. Priest Capital Group underwent significant restructuring in the 14 months following the acquisition. Donovan remained in an operational capacity for the first 6 of those months, long enough to manage a controlled transition, and was then transitioned out with terms that reflected the contractual obligations of his remaining stake, and nothing more than that. He moved his professional operations to a smaller venture in a different sector. His corner office on the 14th floor of the building he had always regarded as an expression of himself was taken over by a managing director from Marcus's partnership who had no personal relationship with the building's symbolic history whatsoever. This was, Marcus thought, exactly as it should be. The project Marcus turned his attention to in the following year was one he had been developing conceptually for some time, a mixed-use development on a waterfront site that combined his architectural instincts with the investment capabilities of the partnership in a way that neither could have achieved independently. It was the kind of work that required both the precision of someone who understands load-bearing structures and the patience of someone who knows that the most significant things are built slowly, over time, on foundations that have been properly assessed before a single wall goes up. He hired a small team. He worked long hours that felt meaningful in the way that work feels when it is aligned with what you actually are. He kept his life simple and his profile low. He did not attend the charity galas anymore, and he did not miss them. He found that the world, without the performance layers stripped away, was considerably more interesting than the performance had ever been. He did not date for the first several months. He was not avoiding it. He was simply occupied with the more pressing project of becoming accurately acquainted with his own life, which had spent years being obscured by the effort of maintaining something that wasn't working. There is a particular freedom, he discovered, in being exactly what you are in every room you enter, not performing diminishment, not performing anything, just arriving with the full weight of your actual self and allowing that to be sufficient. It was, he found, more than sufficient. It was enough to build something real on. The last time he saw Donovan Priest was at an industry event, approximately a year after the birthday dinner. They were in the same room briefly, in the way that people in overlapping professional circles inevitably find themselves in the same room. Donovan saw Marcus first. Marcus could tell by the quality of stillness that crossed Donovan's posture. The adjustment. He nodded. Marcus returned the nod. Neither approached the other. There was nothing in the exchange that required words, because words in that moment would have been a kind of charity that the situation did not call for. And Marcus was not a man who performed gestures without meaning. He got a drink at the bar and found himself in a conversation with a structural engineer he had worked with twice before, and they talked for a long time about a coastal project the engineer was advising on, and Marcus found the conversation genuinely engaging, and by the time he looked across the room again, Donovan Priest was gone. Marcus did not note his departure with anything more than the passing acknowledgement that follows a closed chapter. He returned his full attention to the conversation in front of him, which was interesting and immediate, and had nothing to do with anything that had already been decided. That, perhaps, is the most precise truth of the whole story. The decisive moments had already happened before the birthday dinner even began. They had happened in months of quiet observation, in years of building something substantial without announcing it, in the patient accumulation of knowledge and capability and resource that Donovan had dismissed as absence because it was not visible, and Vivian had missed entirely because she had chosen to stop looking. The evening at the restaurant, the wine, the white shirt, the performed apology, the unperturbed response was not the story. It was only the moment when a story already complete became briefly visible to the people who had been living inside it without knowing its actual shape. Marcus Hale had always understood that the most significant structures are the ones that do their work invisibly. A great foundation is never seen. It exists beneath everything, holding the weight of whatever rises above it, and it does not require acknowledgement to function. It simply holds. That had always been his instinct as an architect. It turned out to be the central truth of his life as well. If you've stayed until the end of this story, you already understand what it's really about. It's not about a glass of wine or a corporate acquisition. It's about what happens when we decide what someone is worth based on what we can easily see and what we miss when we make that decision carelessly. It's about the quiet, unannounced power of a person who simply goes on becoming themselves, while others busy themselves with deciding what that person is allowed to be. We've all been underestimated. Most of us have done the underestimating too, if we're being honest. The question the story asks, and it's a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, is, what do you do with that? Do you correct for it? Do you look more carefully at the people in your life, the ones you filed away in comfortable categories, and ask whether you actually know what you're looking at? That question is worth sitting with. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and if this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone or something or a version of yourself you haven't fully given credit to, then please hit the like button, because it helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you haven't, because there are more stories coming, each one true to the same principle, that patience and integrity are not weaknesses dressed up as virtues. They are the most powerful forces in any room. They simply don't announce themselves when they walk in.